Let's learn about SQL triggers. A SQL trigger is a SQL statement that automatically executes in response to a modification to a table in the database. This means we have a triggering SQL statement that updates a table in some way. The trigger will then be activated and automatically run a SQL statement specified in the trigger. There are three types of triggering statements. We have the insert trigger, which uses insertions as triggering statements. We have a table of students at SQL Guild. We also have an email list of new students. We can use an insert trigger so that adding students to the students table acts as a triggering statement, leading to a trigger to add that student to the email list for new students. Let's say Axel joins SQL Guild. We can add Axel to our students table. If we have an insert trigger on the students table, then we can add a SQL statement in that trigger to add that new student to the new student email list. The next type of trigger is the update trigger, which responds to updates on values in a table. Here, we have a table of athletes. We also have a table storing what our athletes eat. Let's say James increases his orange juice intake to become an unstoppable MVP caliber player. We can update his orange juice intake to 1,100 calories per day. We can use an update trigger on the eats table to notice the update and then have a SQL statement in the trigger to update the calories that athlete eats in a day, accordingly. Finally, we have the delete trigger. Let's say James gets rid of all his apples to only eat powerful orange juice. We can delete the row for the apple in the eats table. With a delete trigger on the eats table, we can automatically run a SQL statement to update the number of calories that James eats. Now, let's start writing out the syntax of a SQL trigger. First, we write the words create followed by trigger. Then we write the name of the trigger. Next, we choose if our trigger is a before trigger or an after trigger. First, we have the before trigger. In a before trigger, we first reach the triggering statement. Then we execute the trigger before we execute the triggering statement. Before triggers are useful in a few different cases. The first use case for before triggers is to validate data. Speaking of validation, the team nutritionist is offended by players trying to drink so much orange juice and is calling in.
I am very offended by how much orange juice the players are drinking. Athletes need a balanced diet. From now on, no more foods can be added to the eating log that are over 1,000 calories.
Here we have our eats table and our athletes table. Let's add Jenny, the rain sprinter, to our athlete list. Let's try to add 1,300 calories of orange juice to her diet. With a before trigger, we'll run the trigger first. We'll get an error because the calorie count is over 1,000. If the calories was 900, then the trigger would finish without error, and then we would execute the triggering statement, which inserts 900 calories of orange juice for Jenny. That trigger could have also updated the calories Jenny had eaten while it was running if you added that code to the trigger. Those calories would have been added before the triggering insert statement. Another reason to use before triggers is to update the current record from the triggering statement in some way. Let's say we have a before trigger for insertions on the eating log table, and we insert 1,300 calories of orange juice for Jenny. Of course, we are using a before trigger, so the trigger gets run first. The trigger can then say, you know what, you can't have quite that much orange juice, so I'll update the insert value for you to just be 1,000 calories, which is the limit. We also have the option to use an after trigger. First, we reach the triggering statement. Then we can execute the triggering statement. Then we can execute the trigger. So a before trigger runs before the triggering statement. And the after trigger runs after the triggering statement. Okay, let's try to code this stuff up. We have an eats table tracking what the players eat. We also have an athletes table with all of our athletes. Let's make a trigger to update the calories an athlete eats when a new item is added to the eating table. Let's get coding. We'll write the create trigger keywords to start. We can name the trigger as update athlete calories. We don't need to do any input validation or change the record from the triggering statement, so we can use an after trigger. We'll use an insert trigger because we are responding to an insertion on the eats table. We write on eats because the triggering statement is an insertion on the eats table. We write for each row. To run some code for each row we insert on the eats table because there are ways to insert multiple rows in one statement in SQL. We have the begin and end keywords to put all our code in. This ensures either all the code runs or none of the code runs, so we don't have to worry about issues in the database from only part of the code being executed. Now, we'll write the update athlete text because we are updating the athlete table. Then we set the total calories for a player to be the total calories, plus the calories in the new row being inserted in the triggering statement. We access that with the keyword new, followed by a dot, and then the calories variable name. Then we just use a where clause to only change the calories for the athlete of the eating log that was inserted. Now, let's execute the code. Okay, let's insert in a row for athlete 1, which is John Doe, such that he drinks 1,000 calories of orange juice per day. We can see it was entered at the bottom of the eats table there. And we can see John Doe's calorie count was increased automatically by 1,000. Let's create a trigger that only allows new insertions in the eating table of 1,000 calories or less. We will run the trigger before an insertion on the eats table, so we write before insert on eats. We want to check each row being inserted. Then we want to run the begin end part of the trigger when the new row being inserted has a calories variable over 1,000 calories. Then we will just raise an exception that the food item has too many calories. If we try to insert 9,000 calories of orange juice, the trigger will raise the error and the insertion won't happen. Inserting 999 calories of orange juice is fine. We can see the 999 calories of orange juice got added, and of course the 9,000 calories didn't get added. Now, let's update athlete calorie counts when eating log entries are deleted. After deleting a row in the eats table, then for each row being deleted, we will update the athlete table. We will set an athlete's calories to its current value, minus the old row's calorie value. Notice we use the word old for deleted rows instead of new. Then we just ensure that the athlete ID values match. If we delete the eating entries for athlete 1, then his calorie count automatically drops to 0. Generally, don't use triggers when there are other features already for that purpose, such as the on-delete cascade feature, maintaining replicas of databases, and supporting materialized views.